finished races where his feet were bleeding through his shoes, where his kidneys were failing, where medical staff told him to stop, and he kept going. And when you hear that, most people think the same thing. He's built differently. That's not normal. I could never do that. But here's what you don't realize when you say that. You're not describing him. You're describing yourself. Because Goggins has said, more than once, that when he reaches the edge of what his body can handle, he doesn't have some secret reserve of physical strength the rest of us lack. He has something else. He calls it accountability. He calls it the callusing of the mind. But 2,000 years before he was born, the Stoics had a more precise name for it. And understanding that name might be the most practically useful thing you'll hear today. The Stoics called it the hegemonic, the governing faculty, the ruling mind. It is not your emotions. It is not your instincts. It is the part of you that decides what every sensation means. And Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire while fighting chronic illness, who led armies while writing philosophy in his private journal, Marcus Aurelius understood something that took David Goggins decades of suffering to prove empirically. Your body does not quit. Your governing faculty quits. And you have been confusing the two your entire life. Think about the last time you stopped something early. A workout, a project, a difficult conversation. What did you tell yourself in that moment? That you were tired? That you'd done enough? That it wasn't worth it? Those weren't observations about your body. Those were verdicts. Verdicts handed down by a part of your mind that has been making decisions about your limits for years, maybe decades, without your supervision. Without your consent. Epictetus, a former slave who wrote some of the most enduring philosophy in human history, put it plainly. He said that the things that disturb us are not events themselves, but our judgments about events. Not the pain, the story about the pain. Not the exhaustion, the story you tell about what that exhaustion means. And here's the part that should stop you cold. That story isn't neutral. That story was written by whoever you were when you were afraid, when you were humiliated, when you failed the first time and decided, quietly, to protect yourself from failing again. Your governing faculty has been optimizing for your comfort, and you've been mistaking that comfort-seeking for wisdom. Now here's the part that most people miss, and this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Goggins didn't start where he is. He was overweight, depressed, working a dead-end job. He failed the Navy SEAL entrance test. He failed it again. And in one of his most honest interviews, he described the voice that told him to quit during those early training days as nearly irresistible. Not irritating, not manageable, nearly irresistible. And most people hear that and think the lesson is, push through. But that's not the lesson. The lesson is that Goggins recognized the voice as separate from himself. He gave it a name, the governor, and he stopped obeying it automatically. That gap between sensation and response, between impulse and decision, that is the entire field of Stoic philosophy. That gap is where Marcus Aurelius spent his entire life. The Stoics had a word for the training of this gap, ascesis, deliberate practice, not physical exercise, although the Stoics walked, swam, and trained in the cold. Deliberate practice of the governing faculty itself. Marcus Aurelius woke at dawn specifically to challenge his comfort-seeking mind before the rest of the day could reward it. He wrote, in private, not for publication, about the temptation to stay in his warm bed as exactly the same psychological weakness that causes armies to break and men to betray their principles. Not laziness, not weakness of character, a governing faculty that has been trained to seek comfort and has never been asked to serve something higher than its own ease. And there is a tradition, older than the Stoics, though arriving at the same place, that describes the governing faculty not just as a faculty, but as your truest self. This tradition held that the intellect, not the instinct, not the appetite, But the reasoning, disciplined, observing mind is what distinguishes the human being from everything beneath it. And the deepest failure of a human life, in this view, is not poverty or failure or loss. It is allowing the lower self, the comfort-seeking, ease-preferring, excuse-manufacturing apparatus inside you, to govern in place of the higher one. Goggins would recognize that immediately. He would call it by different language, but he would recognize it. But here's what Goggins knows that almost no one talks about. It's not enough to recognize the voice. It's not enough to name it once. Because the governing faculty is adaptive. Once it learns that you'll ignore one excuse, it generates a better one. Once it learns that "I'm tired" won't stop you, it tries "you're going to injure yourself." Once it learns that fear doesn't work, it tries reason. The governing faculty will make the case for quitting sound rational. It will sound measured, mature even. And that's when most people fold, not in the first wave of discomfort, but in the second or third wave, when the excuse has been dressed up in logic. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this at length. He described the way the mind rationalizes its own indulgences, not as cowardice, but as prudence, not as avoidance, but as wisdom. Seneca called this the soft conspiracy, the way comfortable circumstances collude with a comfort-seeking mind to make surrender feel like discretion. And the antidote, the thing both of them prescribed, was not willpower. It was attention. The trained habit of watching your own governing faculty as it works, catching the lie before it sounds like truth, observing the moment the excuse is manufactured rather than receiving it as a verdict. Goggins developed his own version of this. He calls it the accountability mirror. Every morning, he looked at himself and named what he was lying about. Not what he wanted to change eventually, what he was lying about today. The ancient ethical philosophers prescribed the same discipline, not as a nightly audit of how you performed, but as a morning offense. What am I lying to myself about, right now, before I have time to dress it up? The governing faculty does its worst work in the silence before the day begins. Both Goggins and the Stoics understood this. Both built their entire practice around attacking that silence. In a moment, I'll give you the exact method, drawn from both of them, that you can use starting tomorrow morning. But first, there is a harsh truth you need to sit with. Most people who read Goggins' books, who watch his interviews, who listen to his speeches, come away motivated. And then they do nothing. Not because they don't want to change. Not because the information wasn't useful. But because motivation targets the conscious mind, and the governing faculty operates below the conscious mind. You can be fully motivated and still completely governed. The Stoics knew this. They never prescribed inspiration. They prescribed practice. Repeated, uncomfortable, daily practice. Not because the practice builds your body, but because the practice trains your governing faculty to recognize what it is, to observe its own operations, and to stop mistaking its preferences for reality. So here is the method. It is simple. It is not easy. It requires no equipment. First, choose one discomfort per day that you would otherwise avoid. Not a large one, a small one. The cold shower you skip. The conversation you defer. The extra mile you decide not to run. Choose one thing that your governing faculty will argue against, will produce a sensible, reasonable, mature-sounding argument against, and do it anyway. You are not training your body. You are training your governing faculty to accept that its verdicts are not final. Second, before you stop anything, a workout, a task, a difficult decision, pause for 10 seconds and ask, is this my body, or is this my story about my body? Is this a real limit, or a limit I've agreed to? You will not always have a clear answer. You don't need one. The 10-second pause is the practice. The gap between sensation and response is the muscle you're building. Third, do what Marcus Aurelius did. At the start of the day, not the end, not when you're tired and reflective, but when the governing faculty is fresh and already starting to negotiate. Name one thing you are lying to yourself about. 1. Not a list. Not a self-improvement inventory. One specific lie your governing faculty told you yesterday that you accepted as truth. And say it out loud. The governing faculty survives in silence. It does not survive being named. Goggins once said that most people reach only 40% of their capacity before they quit. He didn't say this to shame anyone. He said it because he believes the other 60% is accessible to everyone the moment you stop taking the governing faculty's verdicts as final truth. The Stoics said the same thing in different words for over 4 centuries. Epictetus said it as a slave. Marcus Aurelius said it as an emperor. Seneca said it as a dying man. And what they all agreed on is this: the body is not your limit. Your story about your body is your limit. And that story can be rewritten by you, starting tomorrow morning. The question is not whether you have what it takes. You have never actually tested what you have. The question is whether you're willing to examine the governing faculty that has been answering that question on your behalf, quietly, automatically, comfortably, for your entire life. There is one question I want you to answer in the comments. What is the most recent excuse your governing faculty produced that you accepted as truth? Name it, out loud, here. Because the governing faculty survives in silence, and this is one place it doesn't get to stay silent. If this landed, subscribe, because the next video covers what Marcus Aurelius identified as the single most dangerous moment of the day for the governing faculty, and it is almost certainly not the moment you think it is. 1. 590 words. Retention hooks land at cold open accusation 0, 30s. The Goggins didn't start where he is, pivot, 2 minute. The adaptive governing faculty rehook, 5 minute. And the method foreshadow, 7, 8 minute. Open loop on hegemonican is said in paragraph 3 and closed at the method section. A new loop opens in the CTA. Shia wisdom, Akal as truest self, morning Mahasabha, is woven and unmarked as an older tradition and ancient ethical philosophers, no source named.